the CIA psychic who found an alien base on Jupiter. It's not a storm. It's architecture. The room goes silent. Breathing halts. A pen freezes mid-scratch. Across the table, a brown folder snaps shut and a red stamp hits the cover. Restricted. Nobody moves. Behind the glass, someone nods once, slow like a verdict. Years later, the paperwork surfaces, declassified lines proving psychic spies weren't rumor. Real budgets, real taskings, real sessions run under rules that looked like lab science. If a mind touched Jupiter, what did it find, and why bury it? To understand that chair and that breath, we need to go back to the beginning, when the Pentagon blinked. And as you hear this, notice what your own mind tries to fill in, because that reflex, the need to explain the unknown, is exactly what these rooms learn to weaponize. The secret weapon, birth of America's psychic spies. Start with fear. It's the early 1970s, and Washington keeps hearing the same whispers. The Soviets are funding psychic research, telepathy labs, telekinesis trials, classified projects with results nobody can easily dismiss. In a Cold War built on counters and counters to counters, the Pentagon asks a question it hates. What if we're behind on something we can't measure? That's when a small stream of money finds its way to Menlo Park, to a place known for lasers and patents, not prophecy, Stanford Research Institute. There, two physicists, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, build a weird, careful bridge between intuition and instrumentation. They aren't recruiting fortune tellers. They're stress testing perception. And then an artist from Colorado walks in with a quiet certainty and a stubborn streak. Ingo Swann doesn't pitch magic. He pitches method. If you can describe a hidden object under strict conditions, he says, then you've got a signal. If you can do it again, under tighter conditions, you've got a protocol. Here's how they harden it. Strip away clues. Blind the viewer. Replace leading questions with neutral prompts. Record everything. They start calling it remote viewing, and soon it becomes coordinate remote viewing, with sequences and stages, ideograms, sensory descriptors, sketches, then structure. No nouns at first, just qualities. Rough, metallic, cold, vertical, low resonance. A quick mark on paper captures a first impulse, an ideogram like a seismic blip, then the viewer unpacks it with controlled passes. The analyst pushes back any labels. Functions over names. Describe, don't conclude. Early sessions make people uncomfortable because they land. A hidden machine part is sketched with its fins and voids in the right places. A building layout described from 1,000 miles away matches later photographs. An outbounder, a team member who walks to a random site, phones in laughter because the viewer just said fountain, reflective, windy spray, and he's standing at a plaza with a fountain throwing mist. Not every hit is clean. Plenty wobble. But enough specific lines keep crossing reality that the reports move out of the lab and into the hands of people who brief actual operations. The pipeline forms almost by accident. The Army's INSCOM needs edge cases for intelligence. The Defense Intelligence Agency listens because if even 5% of this is actionable, it's cheaper than satellites and faster than agents. The CIA watches warily from the doorway, paying sometimes, pulling back when the ridicule risk spikes. Names change, Skein 8, Grill Flame, Center Lane, but the core keeps working. Sealed targets, disciplined sessions, after-action feedback whenever possible. The files develop a rhythm. Target numbers in envelopes, viewer cooldowns, transcripts with timestamps, and pages of charcoal sketches that look like architecture notes from a dream. Meanwhile, inside the rooms, there's a practical terror. Distance seems to stop mattering. A warehouse 10 miles away feels the same distance as a facility across an ocean. If the signal really doesn't care about miles, then geography, one of intelligence's oldest gatekeepers, just cracked. That raises stakes. If an analyst can't put a fence around the possible, how do you keep it from running off a cliff? They fix it with guardrails. No front loading. No hand gestures. No good job mid-session. Just neutral tones and a mantra. Stay with the signal. Underneath, another rule emerged: starve the ego, feed the data. The second a viewer feels praised, the storytelling brain takes the wheel. Puthoff and Targ publish cautiously in peer-reviewed corners. Nature gets a nod. Internal memos circulate with caveats stacked like sandbags. Inside the Army, a sergeant learns to run a session with a poker face because if his eyebrow jumps, the viewer will chase it. Outside, a skeptical physicist shows up, tries it, and leaves muttering that something's happening, though he doesn't like the word for it. A colonel brings in a problem, describe a sight nobody in the room has seen. and gets back contours and functions. He can check against later reconnaissance. Enough aligns to keep the lights on. Micro-stories start accumulating, the kind that stick to people. A viewer draws a crane above water, circles a box, writes hollow ringing, and a month later a cable news blip mentions a shipyard accident at a location that matches the coordinates. A case officer who laughed in the lobby comes back for a second briefing, this time without the smile because his boss asked for whatever those Menlo Park people have. Meanwhile, inside SRI, they keep sanding down the mystical edges. They teach ideogram drills like push-ups. They catalog sensory bleed, tastes, pressures, tones that show up across viewers at similar targets. The psychology is simple and brutal. Repetition undercuts doubt. Convergence quiets the inner heckler. And still, fear keeps writing the checks. If the Soviets can do this, a memo says between the lines, we can't be the ones who didn't look. Some in the building are true believers. More are pragmatists with a budget line and a promise. Use it as one input among many. Never bet the mission on it, but don't ignore it either. The best remote viewers, like Joe McMoneygle, start racking scores that force serious conversations. Suddenly, the joke at the water cooler isn't as safe to tell. In that atmosphere, an inevitable question slips out during a planning meeting. How far can this go? If a warehouse reads like a warehouse no matter the miles, what about a planet? Someone taps a folder, Pioneer. Someone else says Voyager. The conversation goes quiet for a beat, not because it's ridiculous, but because it's tempting. You can't drive to Jupiter. You can't phone a friend for feedback. But as a stress test of protocol, of signal, of the human operator under hostile physics, it's perfect. A finger points at the sky. The room makes space for the attempt. The proving ground, credibility moments that kept funding alive. Start with the name that made briefers sit straighter, Joe McMoneygle. Former Army intelligence, calm voice, no theatrics. He sits, takes the target number, and starts laying down lines that later match facilities nobody in the room had clearance to see at the time. Cooling towers, oddly spaced vents, a gantry nobody expected, drawn before the photo intel landed. Not perfect, never perfect, but specific in ways that made the post-brief silence long. They built the proving ground with beacon and outbounder trials. One team member walked to a random site, sealed by a randomizer. The viewer, blind to any of it, had to describe where that human body stood. Tall verticals, metallic smell, echo cold shade, he'd say. The outbounder, standing under a bridge in a breezy industrial lot, grinned at the echo. They ran it again and again, stacking statistics against anecdote. In program memos, phrases like beyond chance started showing up next to caveats about small samples and human variance. Protocol became a survival instinct. They fought front-loading like a fire. If an analyst unconsciously nodded when a sketch resembled a crane, the viewer might chase the nod instead of the target. So guardrails got rigid. No nouns until functions appear. No good or close midstream. No could it be, at all. Everything written, everything time-stamped. Later, when the feedback came, photos, measurements, site visits, they'd grade against specifics. Number of bays, orientation of roads, presence of water, mechanical functions described. The more granular the scoring, the harder it was to handwave hits. Quietly, they hacked human bias, constrained language, flattened tone, and you starved the brain's urge to confabulate. Inside the building, the fights weren't just about data. They were about ridicule. A colonel who'd seen a sketch align with a restricted map would argue for more tasking. A career risk manager would ask how to brief a general without detonating the room. We're not selling psychics, someone would say. We're selling an adjunct collection method with cost advantages. It sounded dry, it kept doors open. Meanwhile, the viewers kept showing up, grinding through ideogram drills that left fingertips smudged and shoulders sore. Microstories kept funding alive more than charts ever did. A session calls out arched hollow, resonant, periodic clatter, and a month later a SIGINT report mentions rail stock moving through a curved maintenance shed at the very coordinates. A viewer notes subterranean, reinforced coolant smell, and a later defector debrief includes a bunkered server room with condensation and a harsh chemical odor. These weren't clean bullseyes, they were clusters of right enough detail that, taken together, made it hard to shut the door. When skeptics came, and they always came, program staff did something smart. They recruited them for red team runs. Task us, they said. Pick the outbounder. Hold the envelope. A physicist who'd arrived to debunk left muttering that the hit rate wasn't chance, even. If he hated every explanation on offer, he wrote a private memo, "Signal present, mechanism unknown," which became a quiet tagline inside the unit. Joe's sessions with facilities later confirmed by satellite weren't the only anchors. There were hostage sketches that mapped room geometry within usable tolerances. There were descriptions of unique cranes, odd heating units, the feel of wind patterns around structures, strange, sensory details that weren't in newspapers and didn't match easy guesses. Analysts learned to parse for function. Intake, processing, exhaust mattered more than factory. When those functions matched later images, the marks in the margin were hard to ignore. Even the failures worked as teaching tools. When a viewer drifted into storytelling, nouns too early, narratives too clean, the grade tanked. They flagged those transcripts with AOL for analytical overlay, a scarlet letter that stung enough to keep discipline tight next time. Over months, the signal got leaner. Fewer flourishes, more textures, temperatures, pressures, vector directions, resonances. The language of the program got strange and precise, like engineering from memory. The funding memos read like hedged bets. Preponderance of suggestive correlations, one line would say, followed by insufficient for standalone tasking. But money still moved because case officers kept finding edges in the transcripts they couldn't find anywhere else. In the privacy of closed-door briefings, one colonel said it out loud. "If this gives me a 2-week head start on something I was going to learn anyway, I'll pay for that twice." That's the ground truth of why the checks didn't stop. Not because anyone proved a mechanism, but because specific, verifiable crumbs showed up too often to dismiss. Aerial imagery confirmed the odd rectangle. Signals intelligence confirmed the hum. A later walkthrough confirmed the distance between pillars. Enough of those, and the risk managers looked at each other and shrugged. Keep it small, keep it quiet, keep it going. With Washington half convinced and half hiding its smile, curiosity crept back in. If the method worked across cities and continents, what happened when you aimed it at the outer dark? The proving ground had done its job. Now a few people wanted to stress the steel. Eyes tilted skyward, and the room made space for a target nobody could ever visit. The selector. Why target Jupiter at all? Inside the unit, motives split along a quiet line. One camp wanted a clean stress test, something so far outside normal feedback loops that any crisp structure in the data would mean the protocol held under pressure. The other camp had a stack of mission folders flagged with Pioneer and Voyager telemetry oddities, subtle magnetic wiggles, unresolved thermal signatures, the kind of anomalies that make engineers shrug and analysts wonder. Both impulses pointed the same direction. Jupiter wasn't just big, it was complicated. If remote viewing could swim in that chaos and still surface with structure, then the method had teeth. There was a strategic lens too, the cold calculus that funds weird questions. The Jovian system is a crossroads, massive gravity well, moon network, radiation belts like warning tape. If anyone built infrastructure out there, relay nodes, observation posts, resource harvesters, it would sit where physics already does half the work. Europa and Ganymede, with their ice and oceans, drew scientific interest. But the planet itself, with banded jets and storms older than recorded history, offered concealment. Hide inside noise, let the weather erase your edges, and you can work for a long time without being seen. SRI's culture made the leap easier. They'd already used training as a shield for exploratory targets, ancient sites, deep ocean wrecks, where feedback would be delayed or partial, but the protocol could be exercised without operational blowback. Label it R&D, keep it off the ops calendar, and you could push boundaries under the radar of ridicule. Jupiter fit that pattern perfectly, exotic, distant, and insulated from congressional questions like, how did you use this to brief a commander? The answer, safely, would be we didn't. We're testing limits. Hostile physics were part of the attraction. The planet's atmosphere stacks like a layer cake of pressure and chemistry, ammonia, water, hydrogen, moving at hundreds of miles per hour. For viewers, that meant sensory overload, pressure on the temples, sub-bass hums, metallic tastes that show up in transcripts when targets carry heavy machinery or electrical fields. If those signatures appeared independently across viewers in a place like Jupiter, it wouldn't prove anything on its own, but it would rhyme with known signal behaviors. The team wasn't looking for poetry, they were looking for repeatable rhymes. Still, they needed a question sharp enough to avoid imagination's drift. A tasking line took shape that cut out speculation and forced description. If non-terrestrial engineering exists at the target, describe. Not are there aliens? Not, is there a base? Function before label. Identify geometry, materials, joints, conduits, flows, temperatures, anything that indicates design structure over weather. It was a way to box the mind. The moment a viewer wrote spaceship, they'd be off the rails. The moment they wrote grid, intake, oscillation, the analyst had something to grade against physics. There were cover stories within cover stories. Out loud, it was planetary training. In the memo margin, someone had scrawled, comms architecture? Another wrote resource calculus, a nod to helium, 3 fantasies, and metallic hydrogen lore that haunts speculative engineering papers. None of it was official tasking. All of it set a tone. If we find patterns of intake and exhaust embedded in a pressure band, that's not weather. If we find repeating lattice under shear, that's not a cloud. You don't need aliens to ask if something looks manufactured. You just need to keep nouns out of the room until functions stack. Picking the moment mattered. They cross-referenced Pioneer and Voyager flybys, not for data to feed the viewer. Nobody in the room would be allowed to know specifics, but to time their sessions near periods when the planet's dynamics were in flux. The thinking was crude but practical. Complex systems reveal structure when stressed. If a platform rode the bands like a ship in heavy seas, its behaviors would spike, intake rates, stabilization routines, field interactions, and a disciplined viewer might catch those spikes as motion, heat, resonance, or patterned vibration. Then they built the shield. A sealed envelope held only a random number tagged to Jupiter, described structure, if any, associated with non-natural engineering. No maps, no imagery, no briefing notes were allowed into the session space. The handler rehearsed neutral prompts. The analyst drafted a checklist keyed to functions: load-bearing shapes, regular spacing, non-fractal repetition, apparent interfaces with flow, energy conversion hints. The room went quiet in that particular way it does when people are about to do something that can't be explained or defended if it leaks. There was a quiet argument about feedback. Without photographs of a device in a Jovian jet stream, how would they score? The answer was unsatisfying and honest. You score against internal consistency and cross-viewer convergence, and you mark the file for future probe data. They'd done it before with deep ocean and historic targets. You accept that some questions are payment forward. You write tight transcripts today, so someone else can test them in a decade. It wasn't perfect. It was the only adult option. Finally, the envelope slid across the table. A random number on the front, the mass of a planet behind it. The handler breathed out slow. The viewer closed their eyes and started the cool down, the same way they would for a warehouse or a bridge. The label was cosmic. The discipline was the same. Across the mirrored glass, a pair of officers stood very still. Out in the courtyard, a gardener's blower laid a low hum under the walls. Inside, the silent room took the weight of a simple bet. If the signal doesn't care about distance, it won't care about Jupiter. The session begins inside the protocol. The door clicks, and the room settles into its practiced quiet. The viewer sits with forearms on the table, fingertips loose, eyes closed. Cooldown isn't mystic, it's mechanical. Slow breath. Drop surface chatter. Let the first signal twitch land without chasing it. The handler gives the target identifier only, numbers flat and even. No extra words, no tone that could be read as hint. The pencil waits above a blank sheet. An ideogram snaps down, fast, a reflex mark like a cardiogram spike. The viewer touches it with the pencil tip, eyes still closed. Movement, they say under breath. Broad. Layered. They drag a second ideogram, smaller, hooked. Dense. Pressure. The handler nods without moving the air and says the standard. From the top. The viewer breathes, then starts A B sensory descriptors. Ambient. B signal. They trade clipped adjectives like engineers calling out parts. A cool, still dry. B heavy, fast, wet, charged. Sensory bleed arrives early, like it always does when targets carry weather and fields. Pressure on the temples, the viewer notes. Sub-bass, like a far generator. Taste metallic, not blood, more ozone. The pencil scratches short staccato lines as the hand follows the internal contour. A quick block-in sketch appears, bands, then a curved intrusion that doesn't fit cloud logic. The viewer taps it. This keeps repeating. Feels structural. Regular spacing. The word natural floats up and the viewer swats it away, writes not natural, with a question mark, then circles the curve again. The handler throws gentle sinks. Stay with textures. The viewer touches the paper. Smooth hard, not stone. Maybe composite. Temperature shifts across edges, warm to cool in gradients. The analyst behind the glass tries not to smile because gradients mean function. The viewer lines in a lattice, thin members crossing under shear. Loads distributing, they murmur. Things flex but return. Not random. They redraw the bands, pencil sweeping left to right, then carve a shape that sits within, riding but not dissolving. Floating but they pause, anchored. Anchored to flow, not ground. The paradox hangs there, neat and unsettling. Guardrails keep the lane tight. The handler doesn't ask for labels, only functions. Describe the relationship between the structure and the environment. The viewer starts listing verbs: divert, intake, vent, stabilize, oscillate. They shade a region where the band curls. I feel a pull here like a throat. Material goes in. Heat leaves somewhere else. Their free hand presses their sternum, a reflex when the internal torque ramps up. It vibrates near the edges, regular pulses, not storm random. Ideograms recur as anchor points. The viewer lays 3 identical hooks, then bridges them with thin lines like catwalks. Grid work, they say softly, then halt, aware that nouns can hijack. They cross it out, rewrite grid-like. The pencil flips to the blunt end for shading. Shadowed interior volume here, they say, indicating cavities. Low reverberation. Feels dampened, like sound is swallowed. That note goes into the analyst's checklist under acoustic management, a tell for enclosed spaces doing work. The handler calibrates the pace, just enough friction to keep the viewer from drifting, not so much that the stream snaps. Move 10 meters along the long axis. The viewer shifts, breath changing, seeing repeating ribs, equal spacing, joints at regular intervals. The edges hum. I'm getting. They stop, rub their tongue against their teeth. A taste again. Sharp. Electrical. Not a shock, a field presence. They draw small chevrons along the edges, notation for directional flow. This side takes in. That side exhausts. Feels like harvesting motion from the band. The contradictions stack in clean lines. It's not bolted to anything, they say, voice a notch lower. It rides, but it holds position relative to the flow, like it has a keel, but the keel is made of wind. The handler gives a standard redirect, describe materials. The pencil tip taps, taps. Smooth, hard, slightly yielding under stress. Not metal like iron. Maybe layered skins? They write laminate and underline it. Joints are clean, not rough cast. Precision. They hesitate. There's a repeating pattern of small protrusions, like ports or sensors. They tick. A microstory slips out, quick and human. Left ear goes warm when I pass this seam. The viewer says, hand at ear. It's like stepping near a transformer. They shake it off and keep writing. Low electric hum persists. Harmonics shift with band speed. The structure compensates, counter vibration increases with shear. They sketch an intake mouth, then add strakes downstream. This geometry looks like it wants to drink turbulence and turn it into steadier flow. Analyst guardrails hold the label pressure down. No ship, no building, only relationships. The viewer notes maintenance feel, then scribbles AOL next to it, self-policing the urge to narrate. The handler takes the cue. If maintenance occurs, describe the interface. The viewer touches the paper lightly, as if not to break something. Access paths are thin, linear. They cross voids. I sense traffic, but not people in suits, they say, catching themselves. Not humanists, more present signature. Rhythmic, purposeful. The paradox returns and locks in. Floating, yet anchored to a moving reference. The viewer repeats, slower, like tasting the logic. Anchoring system doesn't touch anything solid. Its control within chaos, holds a place in a conveyor. The pencil hovers, then writes a single word, clean and certain, without the question mark this time. Manufactured. The handler's pen stops. Behind the glass, the mirrored room feels like it leans in. The viewer's breathing settles, the hum in their description doesn't. The session notes are already heavier than weather. The moment everything changed, it's a base. The word sits there, manufactured, and the air leaves the room. Stakes spike instantly, because that single label drags careers into the light. If this transcript reads like weather, it gets filed and forgotten. If it reads like non-human engineering, it becomes a live grenade for anyone who touches it. The handler knows it. The viewer feels it. Behind the glass, a chair creaks, then holds still. The handler takes a breath and keeps the rail tight. Stay with function, they say, voice thin and steady. The viewer nods, eyes closed, pen hovering. I'm tracking internal pathways, they whisper. Long corridors that aren't corridors, they're conduits. Something moves through them, not a person, a medium. Fast when the band surges, slower when calm. There's a harvesting motion. Intake here. The pencil darkens the throat they drew earlier, and then a kind of processing, then venting downstream. The word harvest lands hard because it isn't a storm verb. They mark temperatures with quick hatch strokes. There are gradients across components. This spine stays cooler, a central temperature-regulated unit. Outboard surfaces heat up and shed. When shear increases, the temperature differential spikes. It wants that difference. It uses it. They add dots along ribs, like rivets but cleaner. Regular nodes repeat spacing. They hum individually, then sync. When they sync, the structure quiets, less vibration, more stable ride. The handler glances at the mirror, but stays in rhythm. Describe power. The viewer frowns, tongue pressed to a molar. I don't feel a single core. It's distributed. The band feeds it. The structure returns order. Energy gets skimmed from chaos. There's a field skin, thin, active, tuning the interface with the flow. When gusts punch, the skin stiffens, then relaxes. Like a flexing membrane. They underline skin, add dynamic. The viewer's hand pauses over the intake. There's motion here that isn't just air. Particulates? I sense selection, like a sieve that changes size. It swallows some, rejects others. The rejected material spirals off. The accepted goes inward and disappears into a dull quiet, as if an absorber drinks it. A quick AOL note scratches the margin. Filter? Then gets boxed and set aside. The discipline holds. They angle the paper, draw a curved plane studded with tiny protrusions. These dots feel like sensors or effectors. They adjust phase to keep the ride steady. When one fails, the neighbors increase output. Maintenance cycles run along these paths, two parallel lines with crossbars, and something travels them. Not feet. A presence that's weightless but pushes intent. The viewer's jaw tightens at the word presence, and they murmur, not human. The handler doesn't flinch. Describe behaviors. Purposeful. Timed. It pauses at junctions, applies correction. The hum shifts when it passes. The structure responds, like acknowledging a command. The pencil makes tight circles at node clusters. These are hubs, not just joints. Data moves. I can't catch language, I catch synchronization. They tap the paper lightly, an unconscious telegraph of nerves. The handler stays inside verbs. Map the outer geometry. The viewer's line gets surer. A repeating gridwork, monolithic units linked by flexible connectors. Each unit can detach if stressed beyond limit, then be replaced or reabsorbed. The edges are rounded to shed vortices. Strakes feather in and out to modulate drag. There are sacrificial surfaces that peel away under extreme load and regrow from behind. The analyst writes replaceable skins on their pad and underlines it twice. A microsensation clips the scene. Left nostril stings, the viewer says, grimacing. Chemical? No smell, a sensation. Ionization maybe. The field shifts taste to sharp metal. Not ozone exactly, but near it. They reopen the intake drawing and add internal veins. These adjust angle by a few degrees to keep pressure in a sweet spot. When the band surges, the veins reverse briefly, not to stop flow, to stall it without losing control. The handler risks a hairline nudge. If labeled, what would this overall function be? The trap is obvious, and the viewer steps around it by choosing a noun that's still a function. Habitat, they say, quiet and sure. Constructed habitat, not just a machine. It supports something. Internal spaces aren't empty, they're tuned. They're shielding from radiation, layered fields stacked like onion skins. The interior feels calm in a way the exterior can't. The calm is designed. The pen writes two words without hesitation. Constructed habitat. The mirrored glass holds its breath. The viewer continues, voice steadier now that a frame exists. The monolithic units each carry a specific role: intake, processing, stabilization, shielding. Gridwork ties them. The grid flexes under load, but doesn't fail. It learns. I can feel a learning curve in the hum, micro adjustments that never repeat exactly. It predicts band behavior and prepositions surfaces before the gust arrives. The analyst adds predictive control to the checklist. The handler sees the clock and narrows the pass. Move to the most active interface. The viewer slides a finger along the paper to a junction between intake and shield. Here, this junction sings. Conduits carry heat away, and a colder flow returns. not coolant like water. Heat is shunted into a field that bleeds it off as structured radiation. The spectrum feels blue-white to me, hot but clean. They write conduits, return, bleed, in quick sequence. Then a human moment that never reads in the transcript but lives in it. The viewer's eyes open and track up to the mirrored glass. The pen hovers. "I don't think this is ours," they say, almost apologizing. "I don't think we could put this here and have it live." The handler's pen stops on its own. There's a rustle behind the mirror, then nothing. The decision is already forming. They won't let this run long enough to turn into a lecture. The handler brings it home with procedural tightness. "Any life sign indicators?" The viewer closes their eyes again. Presence counts spike near hubs. Not bodies like ours, not movement we'd recognize. It's like being near a heart you can't see. Rhythms, maintenance cycles. It's not empty. It's tended. They underline tended, then add not human without flourish. The word sits cold on the page. Impact arrives in quiet actions. "End session," the handler says, voice low. The viewer's shoulders drop, the pencil lays flat. The tape stops with a soft clack. Pages slide into a folder with a practiced, careful motion. The chain of custody log appears, and signatures start their march down the sheet, a handshake with future arguments. Post-formal Q&A is tightened to 2 questions. "Any AOL you want to confess?" The viewer taps habitat and nods. "Anything withheld?" A head shake. "That's it." The psychology here is protective. End clean, close loops, deny the brain a chance to embroider the memory 5 minutes later. When the folder closes, the room's oxygen feels thinner. Everyone knows why. A claim like constructed habitat doesn't just threaten the program's credibility, it threatens the storyteller's futures. One leak, one laugh in the wrong office, and careers go cold. So the call is simple: truncate now, minimize exposure, hold the language to functions, and lock the rest. As they stand, the mirrored glass reflects a row of faces that all look a little older. Outside the room, the session moves from human experience to paperwork. The title field stays bland: Jupiter, structural descriptors, because names can detonate. The analyst drafts a compare list keyed to known Jovian physics for later cross-checking. The handler writes a note in the margin: manufactured claim present, confined to descriptors. The folder gets a sticker that means fewer eyes. And while the signatures dry, the question nobody wants on paper curls like smoke under the door. If that wasn't weather, what did we just glimpse? Cross-checking the impossible, science meets the transcript. Start with the blunt physics. Jupiter isn't a solid world, it's a stack of flowing layers, molecular hydrogen and helium up high, water ammonia clouds deeper, then pressures climbing toward metallic hydrogen far below. Floaters, if they exist, would live in the temperate bands where pressure and chemistry allow buoyancy. Roughly the realm where ammonia and water clouds churn and the winds rip like freeways. The transcripts, floating yet anchored to flow, only makes sense if something can ride a jet stream the way a glider rides a thermal, holding station by controlling lift, drag, and phase with the wind itself as scaffold. Engineers have modeled balloon platforms for gas giants, helium bladders, aerostats with variable buoyancy, even dynamic so-called cyclorotors that bite into fast flows to produce station-keeping thrust. None of that proves anything, but it frames plausibility. A large, lightweight structure with adjustable surfaces could, in theory, surf Jovian jets while modulating intake and exhaust to harvest energy. The viewer's intake, processing, vent verbs line up with one class of concept. Convert turbulence and pressure differentials into electrical power, then bleed heat with controlled radiation. On Earth, we do it with turbines and heat exchangers. On Jupiter, you do it with flexible skins and field effects tuned to chemistry and wind shear. Now zoom to the Great Red Spot neighborhood, not for drama, for dynamics. That region's a conveyor, stacked jets, vertical motions, shear zones where flow changes direction and speed. If you wanted to hide, you'd live near those edges. The transcript's predictive control and prepositioned surfaces are exactly how a platform would survive there. Anticipate gusts, pivot vanes a heartbeat early, ride the pressure slopes. Probes like Voyager and Juno. Mapped shear patterns and wave trains that behave like highways. A manufactured object could hold a lane inside that chaos if it constantly shaped its boundary layer, the field skin the viewer described. About that skin, there's a known trick in fluid dynamics: active flow control. Use small actuators to alter turbulence, suppress vortex shedding, reduce drag. Scale that to Jovian speeds and chemistry, and you'd need distributed control points, regular nodes, repeat spacing, to sense and respond in milliseconds. The viewer's dots and nodes that hum individually, then sync, read like an engineer's dream note. A phase-locked grid managing the interface with the flow. It sounds sci-fi, it's also how nature works. Schools of fish and flocks of birds phase-lock to reduce energy cost. An engineered grid could do the same with wind. Energy math matters. Jupiter's atmospheric motions carry staggering power. If you can couple to it pressure differentials across surfaces, piezoelectric-like flex harvesters, magnetohydrodynamic tricks in ionized layers, you can skim usable energy without a big central reactor. The transcript's distributed power, and no single core fits that architecture. Bleeding heat blue-white as structured radiation is a sensory flourish, but the logic holds. Any energy capture in dense, fast, warm flows demands aggressive thermal management. Active radiators would glow in spectra humans describe as blue-white. A remote viewer might translate that as hot but clean. Buoyancy's the hard stop. Hydrogen-helium atmospheres are tricky. Fill a balloon with hydrogen and you lose buoyancy. You need hotter gas, ammonia water steam, or vaporized carried materials to float. The viewer never said balloon, only laminate, skins, and flexing membrane. That nudges the picture toward hybrid lift. Partial buoyancy plus dynamic lift from surfaces that aggressively angle into the wind. The keel made of wind is a weirdly elegant description of a vertical control surface generating restoring forces without touching anything solid. Sailors would recognize the feeling, pilots too. Then the caution flags. Analytical overlay is the program's boogeyman, and space targets invite it. Viewers know Jupiter means bands, storms, pressure. Intake and exhaust could be metaphors the mind slaps onto vortices. The metallic taste, ear warmth, low hum. Those also show up in storm sessions on Earth, industrial targets, even power plants. The transcript's discipline, verbs over nouns, functions before labels, helps, but it doesn't eliminate drift. Without feedback, you can only grade internal consistency and agreement with known physics. You can't call it confirmed. So put the transcript next to probe results and ask small questions. Do jets create stable lanes where station keeping is easier? Yes. Do shear zones offer predictable energy gradients? Yes. Could distributed control nodes reduce drag and manage turbulence? In principle, yes. Juno's wave maps even suggest where control would pay off most. Do we have any evidence of non-natural spectral emissions, regular geometric shadows, or anomalous radar returns that scream grid work? No public data says so. If such signatures exist, they're buried in noise or never looked for. The viewer's sacrificial skins and replaceable units are clever, but that cleverness can be a trap. Good engineering metaphors make great stories. There's a softer alignment too, the tended interior. Juno has shown radiation belts and fields that would shred most biology we know. A calm interior behind layered shielding tracks with any habitat concept there, biological or otherwise. You'd stack fields, materials, gradients. The viewer's onion skins reads like off-the-shelf shielding logic, not revelation. But taken with the hum patterns and predictive control, it sketches a coherent, if speculative, system. A buoyant dynamic platform harvesting motion, managing heat, shielding life, and hiding in plain weather. Final check. What would we expect to see if it were real? Narrowband emissions modulated with jet periodicity. Repeating geometric occlusions in cloud decks. Microshear signatures inconsistent with pure fluid dynamics. We haven't reported them. That doesn't mean they aren't there. It means probes weren't tasked to hunt them, or the signals drowned in Jupiter's volume. The transcript aligns with possibilities, leaps over proofs, and sits on the edge where science ends and hypothesis begins. Which is exactly where this program lived. Long enough to make people uneasy, disciplined enough to keep the door open. The precedents, otherworld targets, and non-human mentions. To understand why manufactured didn't get laughed out of the room, you have to open a drawer already stuffed with weird pages. Ingo Swann sits at the top of that stack. Years before Jupiter, he'd sketched structures on the moon, towers, domes, excavations tucked into shadow. He wrote about it later in Penetration, a book, half memoir, half warning, where he claims he was quietly tasked to look at the far side and saw activity that didn't feel human. Inside program files, those sessions were a different label, disputed, persistent. Disputed because feedback never arrived. Persistent because multiple viewers, on different days, recorded geometric regularities in places where only rock should rule. You'll find a pattern in those lunar pages, discipline strained, then enforced. Handlers slapped AOL over nouns like mining and beacons, but they preserved functions that kept repeating, verticals that bore loads, cavities that dampened sound, surfaces that reflected in non-natural ways. No one called it true. No one threw it out. The quiet rule emerged. Keep the weird pages, argue later. Mars got similar treatment. Some sessions circled Cydonia and other rumor magnets, producing ruins, language the unit learned to distrust. But when protocols tightened, blind tasking functions first, viewers still surfaced motifs. Rectilinear grids beneath dust, hollow volumes, eroded angles that didn't read like dunes. Feedback was partial at best. Orbiter images could tease patterns, then undercut them with new angles. Still, the internal memos show caution, not dismissal. Exotic targets break feedback loops. They also train the signal. Staffers learn the hard lesson. When you can't prove or disprove, you log patterns and move on. Other off-world runs stayed quieter. A handful of deep space training targets asked viewers to describe non-natural engineering if present, a phrasing that kept curiosity on a leash. Across these, certain verbs recurred: harvest, shield, stabilize, repeat. Nouns varied wildly. Verbs converged. Analysts noticed and started a private list of recurring functions that seemed to pop when viewers encountered not weather, not rock. Whatever that meant. Lattice under stress. Nodes that hum. Intake and exhaust arranged against flow. It was a strange lexicon, but it gave the team a way to talk about structure without declaring aliens. Swann wasn't alone. Joe McMoneygle pushed into Mars-era tasks with restraint that impressed skeptics, describing interior coolness, radiation sheltering, and abandoned utility in places later imaged as cracked planes. Ingo's lunar claims stayed the lightning rod, but inside, even his critics admitted something. His sessions often seeded methods others used to get cleaner data. Separate the storyteller from the protocol, and you keep the bones. The memos tell on everyone. 1. Stamped with a date that tracks to moon-focused bandwidth, warns bluntly. Exotics invite AOL. Use only stage 1 to 3 data for analysis. Functions over labels. Delay public brief. Another, softer, says, when patterns repeat across operators without front-loading, archive as candidate motifs. That's how the weird pages became an institutional memory. Not proof, not trash, ingredients for later. There were whispers that an Air Force liaison asked, off-record, whether anyone had ever seen hardware off-world. The answer, in a hallway voice: we see engineering. Hardware's your word. Inside the same month, a session logged regular spacing in shadowed volumes on the moon. No one wrote base. They wrote load-bearing, reflective interior, process noise absent. It's bureaucratic language with sharp teeth. Meanwhile, odd alignments kept the file cabinet closed but unlocked. After a Mars run flagged subsurface voids with acoustic quiet, later radar soundings hinted at layers beneath polar caps. Not confirmation, just rhyme. A lunar session's high albedo facets near a crater rim matched a later glint in sun-low imagery, then vanished at another angle. Analysts called it geometry bias. Viewers called it a nudge. The truth sat in the margin with 3 dots. Program culture adapted. Exotic targets were labeled R&D, quarantined from operations, and graded on internal consistency and cross-viewer convergence. A rule hardened: never lead a viewer into nouns, never let a noun lead analysis. Another corollary: when a descriptor violates natural expectation but repeats independently, you don't elevate it. You don't kill it either. You put it on the shelf marked pattern, await feedback. That's the shelf the Jupiter folder would join. And here's the last piece. Multiple recollections from different insiders remember a page, singular, where base wasn't written, but constructed habitat was. They disagree on who wrote it. They agree it existed. Before Jupiter, those words were already stalking the halls, softened to engineering, buried under structures. After Jupiter, the word tightened, gained verbs, and became harder to ignore. So when the viewer said manufactured, the room didn't hear it for the first time. They heard an echo: moon towers, Mars voids, lattice under stress, now spoken inside a storm that should have erased every straight line. That's why the pen stopped. That's why the mirror went still. Jupiter didn't invent the impossible. It connected the dots the unit had been quietly collecting, and made containment feel like policy, not panic. The Clampdown, how the finding got buried. The folder left the session room with a new gravity. By the time it reached the corridor's secure door, the classification ratchet had already turned. The bland working title, Jupiter, Structural Descriptors, stayed on the front, but a second stamp slid under it that meant fewer eyes, tighter safes, shorter lists. Inside the unit, Need to Know shrank overnight. People who'd seen every outbounder run suddenly couldn't sign the log. Questions got answered with silence and a glance at the clock. Optics drove the first defensive line. Psychic-derived intelligence had always been a PR minefield. Put it next to non-human engineering, and you've written a punchline for a hearing you won't survive. Appropriations committees don't fund embarrassment, so an official stance hardened in memos that read like weather reports. RV lacks actionable reliability, continue only in limited R&D contexts. It sounded responsible. It dug a moat around the Jupiter pages without admitting they mattered. Fragmentation followed. The original session packet didn't sit intact for long. One copy stayed with the unit under a new control number. Another went to a DIA liaison who logged it under a program nickname that never appeared on slides. A third, attenuated version, descriptors without the word constructed habitat, was prepared for a science-adjacent reviewer and then quietly withheld. Briefers rotated out. The handler who'd run the room found himself scheduled for training support instead of taskings. The analyst who wrote predictive control on a legal pad was reassigned to a safer portfolio. Chain of custody rules, meant to protect integrity, became a way to narrow the circle. Each signature added a new risk, so fewer signatures appeared. The after-action Q&A, usually a place to squeeze clarification from a fresh mind, got trimmed to formalities. Even the internal language shifted. Manufactured disappeared from mouths and memos, replaced by anomalous structural descriptor clusters. The noun got killed. The verbs were buried under jargon. Meanwhile, rumor moved faster than paper. A viewer from another team asked why a scheduled cross-check never happened. The answer, calendar conflict, didn't ring true. A civilian consultant who'd helped design stage discipline called to offer a blind rerun. Nobody returned the call. In the cafeteria, two sergeants whispered about a Jupiter thing that made a colonel close a door mid-sentence. The unit had lived with weirdness before, but this smelled different. Not disbelief, containment. Outside the building, the air pressure changed too. A skeptical shop that had been waiting for a chance to tighten the spigot scent around a tidy critique. Exotic targets lack feedback, probability of AOL contamination high, recommend resource realignment. It landed on the right desks at the right moment. A second memo from a friendly corner argued for cautious continuation. Patterns of functional descriptors repeat independently. Archive for future probe comparison. It got noted. It didn't change the trajectory. Then came the brief that killed daylight. A senior with appropriations exposure asked, carefully, whether any recent sessions had drifted into non-terrestrial claims. The answer, true, narrow, incomplete, was that research had explored planetary training under strict controls and yielded inconclusive but interesting data. The word base never entered the room. Habitat didn't either. But in the hour after that meeting, access lists shortened again. You could feel policy harden like poured resin. People adapted. The unit's public face leaned into a safer narrative. Remote viewing as a sometimes useful adjunct on earthbound problems with occasional suggestive successes. Never a standalone, always hedged. The Jupiter folder, which could have detonated that careful balance, was split by design. Descriptors and sketches lived in one sealed envelope. The summary lived in another, stripped of everything that would draw fire. Only two people had keys to both. Time helped the burying. As budgets rolled forward and codenames changed, the old files migrated, some digitized, some boxed, some retired, to storage addresses that looked official and turned out to be cul-de-sacs. A request for the Jupiter session months later bounced between offices that no longer admitted owning it. One reference copy, logged in a card catalog that survived a move, lacked the signature page. Gaps widened, nothing sinister in appearance, devastating in effect. There were leaklets, not leaks. A line in an internal newsletter mentioned planetary R&D runs as a past capability. A former participant, off the record, said, "We once chased engineering in a storm." A FOIA release years later coughed up Jupiter-related remote viewing notes from the early decade, but they looked like geology and weather, not gridwork and conduits. The crucial words were either never. Written the way we think, or written, and then routed into rooms FOIA doesn't reach. The clampdown had a human sound. A late-night phone call canceled a planned replication session with a bland apology. A handler who'd kept a copy of his personal notes destroyed them after a hallway warning he didn't call a threat, but took as one. A viewer who'd written tended, in a margin found his evaluation suddenly focused on AOL-controlled deficiencies from a session that had graded fine before. Careers didn't implode. They cooled. That's how real burying works, quiet pressure over loud bands. Institutionally, the endgame was always coming. Stargate would be folded under language that reads like a shrug. Inconclusive, not actionable, no demonstrated unique value. Those sentences were built from truth and choice. Truth, variability, noise, failures. Choice, ignore the odd transcripts that never found feedback because they were too far ahead of the probes. The Jupiter folder became the perfect example of what the complex hates. An answer with no immediate metric to score, carrying a cost and ridicule. When the unit finally sunset, the public could read a narrative that made sense. Experiments tried, some hits, too many misses, no clear mechanism, program closed. Inside former staff, another narrative stuck. Fragments exist, enough to rebuild a day. They remembered the pen stopping, the mirrored glass going still, the word no one wanted on paper. They remembered how fast a room that had lived with unusual claims shifted from curiosity to lockdown. So the finding didn't vanish. It congealed in the only place the file cabinet couldn't erase, memory. A handful of people carried a version of the transcript in their heads, stripped of names and numbers, but heavy with verbs. And because they couldn't show the page, they told the story in careful pieces. Engineering in a storm, grid-like flex under shear. A habitat word that got boxed. A chain of custody that tightened like a fist. Containment worked. It didn't make the hum go away. The human cost, the viewer, the handler, the aftermath. Start small where programs always end, in a hand that won't stop shaking when it signs a name. The viewer's signature on the chain of custody log is usually neat. Today it jitters a little, a jitter they'll notice later when they pull copies to compare. After the session, the viewer sits with coffee that's gone cold while still in the pot. They pick it up, sip anyway, grimace, and set it down without looking. They're not thinking about coffee. They're replaying the hum, the sense of presence that wasn't theirs, the word habitat sitting heavy in their chest. There was supposed to be a follow-up that night, a second pass to test convergence, a fresh envelope with a sister target keyed to the same latitude band. The calendar had it blocked, lab lights reserved. The call comes late instead, clipped and apologetic. Training realignment, delay 72 hours, we'll advise. The viewer listens, says copy, and hangs up. They don't sleep much. When they do, they wake with a left ear warm and a phantom taste of metal in their mouth, a body echo that refuses to clear. Micro-confession arrives in a hallway the next day. A colleague asks how the planetary run felt. Curiosity plain, protocols observed. The viewer says low, engineering in a storm, then swallows the rest. The colleague nods like someone who's learned to accept half answers. Later alone, the viewer writes 3 words in a notebook they keep off-site. Tended, intake, shielded. They underline tended twice and shut the cover like a lid. The handler absorbs it differently. They've done this long enough to wear calm like a uniform. After the session, their pen stop wasn't fear, it was calculation. What questions can I ask without inviting nouns? What do I protect? The viewer, the unit, or the transcript? In the afternoon write-up, they keep verbs clean and strip their own adjectives until the page feels sterile. Then the reassignment email lands. Transitioning to training support. It reads like a courtesy. It feels like a door easing shut. Home looks ordinary from the sidewalk. Inside, the handler stands in a quiet kitchen, staring at a notepad where groceries share space with phrases like convergence run canceled and custodianship split. They scratch a line through convergence. They pour coffee they won't drink and watch it steam until it doesn't. Retirement will come sooner than planned. A move to a house with fewer neighbors. A lawn that hums under an AC unit that keeps perfect mechanical time. People around them notice small changes. The viewer starts arriving early and leaving on time, something they never did. They assign themselves to earthbound targets, bridges, warehouses, desert installations, like someone choosing flat water after a near drowning. They still perform. The ideograms still snap. But the moments when their hand reaches for a noun, then sets it down, happen more. Often, the handler, before they step out of the circle, sees it too and says nothing. Discipline looks like restraint from the outside. Inside, it can feel like being gagged. There's a late-night call that gets canceled mid-ring. The viewer dials because the humming won't fade, because they want to ask if anyone else ever wrote "tended" in the margins. The handler's number lights on the phone. The viewer lets it buzz, then presses end. Protocols don't cover this kind of contact, but culture does. Keep the weird pages, keep quiet about the weird feelings. The viewer writes another word in the off-site notebook, alone. A field debrief the following month includes a question about AOL discipline. The viewer answers straight, checks their own impulses, admits the habitat moment as overlay, then qualifies it. Function stacked first, the label came last. The evaluator nods politely and marks a note anyway. Later, the viewer overhears someone say, "We need to watch for storytelling tendencies," and the phrase hangs in the air like a verdict. It's not punishment, it's an adjustment. It still lands like a bruise. Off camera, the handler shares a sliver with a spouse who knows better than to ask for details. "I saw someone cross a line they didn't mean to," they say, "and I shut the door to keep them safe." The spouse squeezes a hand. The line doesn't get a name. The hand keeps its shake for a week, then steadies. Early retirement paperwork sits ready in a drawer, and signed for 3 days, then signed with a ballpoint that skips on the H and leaves a pale tail on the R, like a comet. The unit moves on in public. Internally, people avoid the Jupiter file like a live wire. The viewer gets reassigned to a data review role for a quarter to broaden skills. They accept it with a small smile you wear when you know the shape of a decision you didn't make. In a quiet moment, they tell a friend over lunch, it felt maintained, and the friend looks at the tabletop and says, "We're not supposed to keep nouns." They both laugh without humor and change the subject. The cost isn't scandal, it's drift. The viewer's career doesn't crash, it fades sideways. The handler's ends earlier than planned, traded for a quiet life with morning walks and a mind that sometimes listens for a hum that won't come. Both carry a private conviction that feels like contraband. A mind brushed a machine inside a storm and came back with verbs. Living with that without saying it out loud becomes its own job. Years later, when declassified crumbs start surfacing and podcasts chew on moon towers and Mars ruins, the viewer hears a host repeat a phrase, "engineering in a storm," and feels their chest go tight. They don't call in. They don't write a book. They flip their off-site notebook open for the first time in years and see 3 words underlined: tended, intake, shielded. They close it gently, put it back, and stand very still, as if movement might make the memory spill. So what was it doing there? That question won't quit. It's the one that visits at red lights and in grocery aisles and in the 30 seconds before sleep. It's the one that made a handler tilt their head in a kitchen and listen to an air conditioner hum like an answer. It's the one that keeps a viewer from drawing an easy storm again, even on a sunny day. Theories: what a floating base on Jupiter would be for. Start with the bluntest motive: energy. Jupiter's atmosphere is an engine room. Pressure gradients, savage winds, electrical storms with charge separations that dwarf anything on Earth. A platform riding those bands could skim power from motion and field. Picture distributed harvest, flexible strakes converting gusts into mechanical work, field skins modulating ion flows, nodes phasing together to pull steady wattage from chaos. The intake vent behavior the viewer mapped fits. You'd swallow turbulence, smooth it, bleed heat through radiators that glow in spectra our minds translate as blue-white. In that math, a habitat isn't just living space. It's a power plant you can hide inside weather. Next motive: materials. A resource harvester wouldn't just drink energy, it'd sift matter. The transcript's sense of selection: accept some particulates, reject others, reads like adaptive filtration. Trace elements, complex ices, and charged aerosols run in streams across latitude bands. A smart sieve could sort species by mass and charge, feed them to internal processing, and eject waste on a tuned trajectory that vanishes into noise. Metallic hydrogen as a prize gets whispered a lot, but even without miracles, helium, 3 fantasies, and rare isotopes stay on the table. A grid that learns gust cycles could optimize capture without ever flashing a clean signal to a passing probe. Surveillance makes strategic sense. The Jovian system sits like a listening post at the edge of our neighborhood. A concealed station inside the bands could aim instruments outward, using Jupiter's bulk as a shield, and its flux as cover. The hum the viewer tracked might not just be structural control. It could be data churn. distributed nodes timing observations to match the turbulence, so signatures ride the noise floor. If you're watching inter-system traffic, monitoring radio leakage, or even mapping gravitational microperturbations, this is prime real estate. It's far enough to be safe, loud enough to stay hidden, close enough to matter. Weather management isn't glamour, but it's survival. A long-lived platform must tame its sea. The transcripts, predictive control, and prepositioned surfaces hint at a machine speaking fluid dynamics fluently. That's not vanity, it's mission assurance. Stabilizing a lane within a conveyor lets everything else work. Energy, materials, sensing, maintenance. A smart grid could also act as an experiment, a field laboratory learning to sculpt atmospheric flows at scale. Field extraction from charge separations, storm-to-grid conversion, sounds like a headline, but internally it's about keeping the platform's environment within operating windows, shaving peaks, filling troughs, never leaving fingerprints that scream engineered. Then there's the quiet option, sanctuary. If the interior feels calm by design, layered with radiation shielding like onion skins, a portion of the structure is for inhabitants, whoever or whatever they are. Habitats don't just shelter, they regulate. Pressure, chemistry, temperature, background fields, all tuned. The tended motif suggests cycles, maintenance runs, routine checks, rhythm in the hum. That could mean crewed presence, autonomous caretakers, or a hybrid. A tended habitat implies culture, procedures, thresholds, resource plans. It isn't a stunt. It's a chapter 2. We can't ignore the relic theory. A derelict rides until it can't. The viewer sensed learning, synchronization, and responsive skins, behaviors that smell active. But a relic with partial systems online can still hum and stabilize, like a stranded ship with bilge pumps and auto trim surviving on backup. In that scenario, the intake vent signatures could be housekeeping, not mission. Bleed heat, dump momentum, keep structure intact. Maintenance cycles might be ghost routines. The presence could be machine reflex, not mind. Derelict or active changes the stakes. One is archaeology in a storm, the other is traffic in our backyard. Concealment logic stitches everything together. If you wanted to hide infrastructure near us, you wouldn't park it in cold vacuum, where a specular glint gives you away. You'd bury it in weather, the thickest, noisiest, most dynamic cover available. Jupiter's bands give you camouflage, mobility, and excuses. Any anomaly gets filed as atmospheric complexity. Any periodicity gets drowned in shear. A platform designed to look like turbulence most of the time, and only briefly like geometry, would survive decades of casual observation. The viewer's sacrificial skins make concealment practical. Shed signatures under stress, grow them back without leaving a trace. What about communications? A relay nested in that chaos could bend its emissions to ride the planet's own chorus. Modulate on harmonics embedded in natural oscillations, and you can talk without broadcasting. The hubs, the viewer marked as data nodes, could aggregate sensor feeds, rotate encryption schemes keyed to turbulence, and beam through windows cut into the storm profile. If you're coordinating with moons, Europa, Ganymede, or even deeper assets, Jupiter gives you line-of-sight schedules and gravitational assists. A base disguised as weather becomes a router in the sky. Now a darker use, extraction beyond resources. Field work on Jupiter might serve as training wheels for planetary engineering, learning to steer fluids at scales that make climate bow. If someone wants to regulate environments elsewhere, this is graduate school. The grid learns jet behavior, tunes responses, transfers lessons to thinner atmospheres where interventions could be subtle and sustained. The ethics of that are beyond our reach. The logic isn't. Finally, the hybrid motive, all of the above, staggered over time. Early phase, deployment and learning. Middle phase, harvest and observation. Late phase, refit, upgrade, maybe mothball. A platform this complex wouldn't be static. The viewer felt predictive control and maintenance rhythm, which implies evolution. If our probes ever caught hints, we might be seeing a single season in a long program. That's why the theory set refuses to pick one box. Energy keeps lights on. Materials feed manufacture. Surveillance keeps you safe. Weather mastery keeps you alive. Sanctuary gives you reason to stay. Concealment lets you do it for as long as you want. Meanwhile on Earth, echoes in tech and policy. While that storm-weaving theory sat sealed, Earth started whispering in hardware. High-altitude platforms, balloons, winged aerostats, pseudo-satellites quietly matured past science projects. Engineers pushed flexible laminates, morphing skins, and distributed control nodes that listened and acted in milliseconds. Papers about active flow control, suppressing vortex shedding with tiny actuators, migrated from journals to prototypes. None of it wore a Jovian label. But the language rhymed: skin that senses, nodes that sync, membranes that flex to ride turbulence instead of fighting it. Across the valley, materials labs courted extremes. Polymers that stiffen under field, ceramics that shrug off thermal cycling, multilayer laminates with embedded sensing. The pitch decks loved re-entry, hypersonic, radiation tolerant, and variable permeability. Buried in those slides were phrases a viewer would recognize: sacrificial layers, self-healing films, graded shielding. If you asked why now, the answers were terrestrial: speed, heat, survivability. If you squinted, it looked like the earthbound edge of a problem set our transcript described inside Jupiter's bands. Funding patterns told their own subplot. Black budget watchers noticed an uptick in atmospheric energy, line items tucked under innocuous program elements. Not solar, not wind farms. Field interaction demonstrations, turbulence harvest studies, ionospheric coupling. The memos were bland, the timing was curious. A cluster appeared within a window that matched the session's era by a few fiscal years, as if someone got just enough of a nudge to push money toward interfaces that drink chaos and spit out order. Policy beats shuffled in lockstep. NASA cycled interest back to the Jovian system with mission concept studies that suddenly found favorable ears. Europa orbiters, Ganymede magnetometer payloads, long-dwell atmospheric probes that sounded like feasibility drills for staying power in nasty environments. On paper, the drivers were ice oceans and life questions. And they were. But in meeting rooms, a parallel fascination surfaced. How long can we hold station in heavy radiation while stabilizing a platform in stacked jets? You don't need a base to want that answer. You need ambition. Contractor behavior left footprints. Requests for proposals flagged extreme environment materials, radiation-hard distributed electronics, and fault-tolerant mesh control. Bids spiked from the usual primes and a crowd of specialty shops that live between academia and black rooms. You could map the spikes on a wall and draw lines to conferences where adaptive lattices and predictive control on chaotic flows were the hot hallway topics. It read like a long, careful pivot, from single robust components to swarms of smart, cheap nodes that can fail gracefully and still hold pattern. Meanwhile, DARPA being DARPA, someone greenlit morphing aircraft skins and underwater flow control tiles. The demo showed drag reduction and noise shaping, useful measurable wins. The subtext was a ladder. Once you can write code that learns a flow and prepositions surfaces, you can port the logic. Air today, ocean tomorrow, gas giant someday. The steps didn't scream conspiracy. They whispered capability. There were rumors, the kind that never land in print. A test range lit up with an experiment labeled atmospheric coupling that ran at night and used a transmitter array not tied to weather research. A briefing slide, glimpsed across a hallway, showed a mesh of nodes glowing in phase and a caption about coherent field shaping under shear. Engineers talk in specifics, spies hear metaphors. Either way, you heard the Jupiter hum. Inside agencies, caution survived. Program managers used the safest language: resilience, autonomy, survivability. The phrase hide in noise rarely reached minutes, but it lived in design goals. Systems needed to blend, adapt, and avoid sharp signatures. It's good doctrine in a world of sensors. It's also the only way to imagine machinery living inside violent flows. The old viewer's verbs, harvest, stabilize, shield, reappeared as bullet points with budgets. Public science played a cleaner role. Juno's data poured into models that mapped wave trains, shear edges, and jet periodicities with ruthless beauty. Students built simulations where virtual particles surfed pressure slopes like surfers on point breaks. A few clever papers asked how a controllable body might hold position in such fields using only local feedback. No central brain, just neighbors syncing. The equations didn't care about provenance. They cared about stability. Skeptics could point and say, this is normal evolution. Materials get tougher. Control gets smarter. Missions get braver. That's true. It's also true that timing and taste matter in the bureaucracy. After the session era, active skins, distributed sensing, mesh control, and fault-tolerant phase locking gained strange gravity in proposals. Coincidence is a terrible historian and a decent alibi. Patterns don't prove a base. They prove attention. Policy language shifted in small ways. Roadmaps started carving out persistent presence in high radiation regimes. Mission concepts budgeted more mass for shielding and autonomy, less for human in the loop. Tactical documents floated, sensing from within adverse mediums as a 10-year goal. It wasn't poetry. It was a to-do list aligned with an idea you can't say in a hearing. We might need to live inside storms. If anyone believed the Jupiter page, they never wrote it that way. They built stepping stones instead, funded skins that feel, nodes that sing together, platforms that ride chaos. Earth echoed with prototypes that don't confess their origin story. The hum moved from a transcript to test stands, from a room with mirrored glass to a hangar with safety tape on the floor. Whether that's prudence or proof depends on which part of you still hears architecture inside weather. The skeptic's case, Steelman then stress test. Start with the strongest version of doubt. Viewers knew the target was Jupiter eventually, the skeptic says, because everybody knows Jupiter has bands and storms. Even if the session was blind, the cultural residue leaks in. A mind primed by documentaries and textbooks will default to pressure, turbulence, lightning. So when a transcript says sub-bass hum, metallic taste, heavy flow, that could be inference, not signal. Whether words are safe guesses dressed as data. Add the front-loading problem. A handler who pauses a fraction too long, an analyst who exhales on a sketch that looks like a grid. That's enough to bend a session. Once a viewer thinks structure, every curve becomes rib, every gap becomes conduit. Analytical overlay does the rest, building a machine from clouds. Exotic targets amplify this drift because the brain hates blank spaces. Without feedback to push back, the mind fills in. Then sample size. People remember the hits, skeptics say, not the sea of misses. For every rings around Jupiter's story, there are 10 sessions graded indeterminate. Selective memory builds myth from anomaly. If you want to be rigorous, you don't cherry-pick a day when the words landed. You score every day with the same ruler. On that ruler, remote viewing yields a noisy distribution with fat tails. Enough to thrill a storyteller, not enough to brief a policymaker. Now the base language itself. Nouns attract meaning like static, manufactured, habitat, grid work. Those might be shorthand for a felt regularity, not literal engineering. The skeptic Steelman says, keep the verbs stabilize, damp, repeat, but strip the nouns. Once you do, what remains can be mapped to known Jupiter dynamics. Convection cells stabilize, waves damp, bands repeat. You don't need non-human hands to see order in chaos. There's also the feedback famine. On Earth, you can grade a session against photos, blueprints, walkthroughs. On Jupiter, you can't. No immediate ground truth means every claim lives on internal coherence. That's not science, the skeptic argues. It's literature, consistent tone, recurring motifs, clever metaphors. Beautiful writing isn't evidence. Without a feedback loop, protocols become performance. Even the learning grid motif can be naturalized. Phase locking shows up everywhere, metronomes on a shared surface, fireflies flashing in sync, vortices shedding at regular intervals. A viewer feeling rhythms might translate them as nodes humming individually, then syncing, when it's just fluid dynamics. Predictive control could be the mind's after-the-fact label for a storm's quasi-periodicity. Our brains are built to forecast. We retrofit purpose onto pattern, and bias cuts both ways. Analysts inside a program want to keep funding. Unconsciously, they'll grade generously, preserve the weird pages, and argue for R&D. Confirmation bias doesn't need malice. It needs mortgages and mission pride. A skeptical red team notes the incentives. Survival favors intriguing over null. That doesn't make anyone dishonest. It makes them human. Now stress test the Steelman. Sealed tasking happened. Numbers in envelopes. Handlers trained to poker face. Viewers penalized for nouns, praised for clean functions. In that environment, repetitions still surfaced. Lattice under shear, intake vent pairs, nodes that sync. Those weren't one person's poetic bent. They appeared across operators, across days. If culture alone drove them, you'd expect wider spread in metaphors. Instead, the verbs converged. Next, the specificity test. Anchored to flow is not a textbook phrase. It's a weird, engineer-grade paradox that maps to control theory in moving media. The keel made of wind beats cliché. Sacrificial skins and replaceable units aren't storm words either. They're maintenance concepts. A skeptic can say those are clever guesses. Fair. But clever guesses repeated blind are a different animal than boilerplate. Consider unknown then knowns in the record. The rings anecdote gets overused, but there are other cases where viewers described functions later imaged: cooling, shielding, patterned acoustic dampening in earthbound targets. That history doesn't transfer proof to Jupiter. It transfers priors. If a method has produced verifiable function first wins, you don't discard function-rich, unverified transcripts. You park them in await feedback, not trash. Address inference creep. Program staff tagged AOL in real time, boxed nouns, and trained viewers to confess their own overlays. In the Jupiter run, habitat got flagged by the viewer as overlay and then justified from stacked functions. That self-policing matters. It doesn't erase error, it lowers drift. A skeptical standard would demand multiple independent Jupiter sessions converging on the same motifs. Those attempts were planned, then cancelled. That's not a hit for believers, it's a strike against rigor. It also looks like policy fear, not scientific care. And the bias argument? It cuts both ways again. Ridicule risk pushes managers to downplay anomalies. Appropriations culture punishes weirdness. If you're gaming incentives, you don't write constructed habitat. You delete it. The fact that the words survived in any form suggests someone valued fidelity over safety for at least one page. That's a point for integrity, not fantasy. Noise remains the adult verdict. Remote viewing is messy. So is Jupiter. But the stress test isn't prove aliens. It's do disciplined minds, under blind, produce coherent, physics-scented structure where guesses would smear. On that metric, the transcript holds more than storm poetry. It sketches systems thinking, distributed power, active skins, predictive control, maintenance cycles. You can naturalize those as metaphors. You can also see them as a design brief waiting on a probe. So the Steelman lands here. Treat the Jupiter session as an R&D artifact, neither gospel nor garbage. Graded on internal consistency, cross-operator motifs, and fit to plausible physics. Demand replications. Demand probe-informed falsifiability. Until then, keep the weird page, mark it unresolved, and resist both temptations, the comfort of dismissal and the thrill of belief. That balance is the psychological hinge. Skepticism strong enough to halt fantasy, curiosity strong enough to outlast ridicule. The quiet consensus, what insiders admit off camera. When you cut the microphones and step out of the briefing rooms, the language softens into something human and annoyingly honest. It worked sometimes. Sometimes it didn't, like people. That refrain shows up in living rooms, on back porches, in the quiet parking lots after conferences where old colleagues shake hands a second too long. They don't sell miracles. They sell variability with enough bright spikes to keep them awake at night. Ask them about exotics, and the tone shifts again. Off-world targets weren't operations, they say. They were R&D sandboxes, places to stress discipline, mine ideas, and teach the mind to hold structure without the crutch of quick feedback. Nobody deployed a remote view to brief a commander on Jupiter. They used it to refine the muscles that later drew usable maps of airfields and warehouses. And still they mined those pages. If a function stacked clean, intake, stabilization, shielding, they kept it, tagged it, and tossed it on a shelf labeled later. That shelf matters. Unofficial guidance circulated like folklore. Archive anomalies, don't annotate them to death, and never let a noun drown the verbs. Future tech may decode what today feels like metaphor. A former analyst says it plain over a weak hotel coffee. We were writing notes for instruments we didn't have yet. That's not romance. That's how people who live with incomplete feedback stop themselves from burning their own library. Bring up Jupiter and the room doesn't go silent, it goes careful. Multiple recollections include a page, singular, where constructed habitat appears. The debate isn't whether anyone wrote it. The debate is who, and whether the word survived the official summary. One former handler remembers circling it with a pencil and writing function support label in the margin. Another swears the noun got boxed as AOL, and the box got ignored because the verbs had already built a machine. They disagree on details. They agree on the hum, the sense of synchronized nodes learning a flow, a structure holding a lane inside weather. Here's the consensus they live with. Exotic sessions were useful in the same way wind tunnels are useful. You don't fly the tunnel, you learn in it. You teach the operator to resist the ego's need to name. You test whether the signal survives speed and noise. You collect motifs that recur under pressure. Tended, laminate skins, distributed nodes. Those words show up in different voices in different years, Enough that people stop calling them quirks and start calling them motifs. Nobody claims proof. They claim patterns and patience. They also admit the politics. You can feel ridicule like weather in a building. Careers learned to bend under it. So the quiet rule grew teeth. Keep the weird pages. Don't lead with them. Don't build budgets on them. When a senator asked what unique value the unit offered, nobody reached for Jupiter. They reached for hostage rooms and industrial sites with feedback. But later, in a bar with the lights low, the same briefer would say, "I've seen engineering verbs pop up in places we couldn't send a camera." That doesn't turn them into believers. It turns them into archivists. One senior viewer kept a private glossary, verbs only. Harvest, stabilize, shield, vent, sink. Next to each, tick marks for how often it appeared blind across operators. Base never made the list. Habitat appeared once boxed with a note. Label followed 4 stacked functions. Years later, when someone said Jupiter in a podcast, he didn't argue. He pointed to the tick marks and said, "We saw that kind of work more than once." Ask what they'd do differently, and you get the same answer from 3 mouths. Replicate under tighter controls and lock in cross-operator convergence. Stage 1 to 3 only. No nouns until functions stack across at least 2 independent runs. Pre-register criteria with a hostile auditor. Pair sessions to probe schedules so feedback can land within human attention spans. None of that happened the way it should have. Budgets and optics and timing won those arguments. So the quiet consensus isn't a verdict. It's a posture. Treat the Jupiter page as a training artifact with unusual coherence. Don't sell it. Don't bury it. Keep it accessible to the next instrument capable of saying yes or no. And here's the part they don't write down. Several remember opening a file and seeing a line about engineering in a storm. They remember the pen that stopped, the breath that caught, the way the room changed shape. Off camera, they'll admit the simplest thing a professional can say. Something was there worth not forgetting. The return to the room, reconstructing the final minutes. The room didn't breathe the same way anymore. The viewer's pencil hovered over the last intake sketch, then drifted to blank space like it was listening. Traffic, they whispered. Not vehicles, activity. A rhythm that passes, repeats, returns. The handler kept voice neutral. Described the character of the activity. The viewer's eyes fluttered. Maintenance. Not repairs after failure, care to prevent it. It moves along the thin paths I drew, pauses at hubs, adjusts something I can't name. After it leaves, the hum tightens, less wobble, more coherence. Stay with the interface you marked, the handler said. The pencil found the junction where shielding overlapped intake. It's the busiest place, the viewer said softly. Like a throat with nerves. When flow spikes, the field skin here thickens. Conduits engage in sequence, 1, 2, 3, heat shunts, then returns cool. The phase across the node array shifts together, like a flock banking. They made 3 quick dots and a circle. Hub. Shift to the exterior edge, downflow side. The viewer slid their hand, then frowned. I'm getting a scraping sensation on my teeth. Field interference or particulate abrasion. Sacrificial layer sloughs off in ribbons, revealing fresh laminate beneath. The sloughed material curls and vanishes into the band. It looks messy, but the grid doesn't care. It anticipated the shed. The handler wrote "sacrificial peel" in their notes and underlined twice. A brief silence expanded. The viewer broke it with a quiet confession. Presence increased. It's closer now. The handler resisted the urge to look at the glass. Characterize the presence through behavior. The viewer nodded. Punctual. It arrives before stress, not after. It knows the gust before the gust arrives. Not human-shaped. More like a field signature with intent. Contact doesn't jostle the structure, it tunes it. The pen tip trembled, then steadied. Moved to an interior volume with lowest reverberation. The viewer's breath shallowed. Here. Still layered calm. Radiation feels remote, like rain on thick glass. The hum is dim, steady, almost reassuring. They caught themselves, boxed AOL, wrote calm by design. Geometry, the handler asked. Curved, no sharp corners. Surfaces damp and echo. The air, or whatever counts as interior medium, holds steady temperature. I'm sensing slow circulation, not convection. The idea of crew keeps trying to surface. I'm boxing it. Note any repeating maintenance cycle. The viewer's head tilted slightly, ear turned toward paper. Every few minutes, a resonant sweep passes from bow to stern, if those words apply, checking node health. When a node lags, neighbors overcompensate, Then a micropresence arrives and resets baseline. The sweep continues. It's boring in a way that feels like safety. The handler glanced at the clock. This had to end clean. Scan for anchors. The viewer smiled without humor. Anchors are made of movement. There's no tether to rock. The reference is the conveyor itself. When the band shifts latitude, the platform slides with it, preemptive, not reactive. They added arrows along the grid's flank. Corrective impulses are tiny and constant, never large and late. Map a failure mode, the handler said, voice low. The pencil hesitated. If too many nodes drop out, the skin loses coherence. Drag rises, shear bites, units detach along design seams, and are left to the band. Survivors reconfigure, close ranks, stabilize. Maintenance then focuses on regrowth, fabrication of lost skins. The viewer wrote designed loss and underlined it twice. The handler weighed one last push. Any signature that would be detectable at range? The viewer tasted the air. Narrowband emissions riding natural oscillations, like hiding voice in wind. Blue-white thermal spikes during bleed cycles, short and faint. Microshear patterns that look wrong if you're expecting pure fluid dynamics. They exhaled. Nothing flashy. All disguise. Decision time landed. The handler's pen tapped once. Conclude with any withheld impressions. The viewer squeezed the pencil, then set it down. It's tended, they said, no flourish. Not ours. A second passed, too. End session, the handler said. Silence took the table. Paper stacked. The tape clicked. Custodianship split was said out loud. Names, times, signatures. The viewer signed cleaner than they felt. The handler slid the folder into a slim metal box. In the hallway, the AC hummed a steady, indifferent note. A key turned. The mirrored glass behind them reflected a blank room. The hum, once heard, didn't leave. What this means if it's real, and if it isn't. If it's real, then non-human infrastructure has been operating within our neighborhood, not as a flash in the sky, but as a working machine woven into a planet's weather. That pushes strategy from romance to logistics. Surveillance isn't just looking outward, it's listening inside noise 4. Signatures that hide on purpose, narrowband emissions that ride natural oscillations, microshear footprints, thermal bleed pulses too tidy for storms. Diplomacy stops being hypothetical. You plan for first contact that already happened by proxy. You reassess planetary security with humility. Our best instruments miss geometry and chaos, so policy should budget for the blind spots we just mapped with verbs. If it's real, our posture shifts from search to coexistence. You don't scramble jets at a storm. You scale instruments, align orbits to linger in lanes where station keeping makes sense, and publish requests for data products that look odd. Phase-locked anomalies, repeat geometry beneath fractal flows. Juno's successors become loiterers. Radiation-hard swarms learn to hold a lane and eavesdrop like neighbors on the same street. Meanwhile, Earth becomes modest. We worry less about planting flags and more about learning to survive in fast, loud systems, oceans, ionosphere, supply chains, that echo Jupiter's lesson. Stability is a conversation with turbulence, not a fight against it. If it's real, culture has to absorb a bruise. We didn't notice a machine because it wore weather. We dismissed a transcript because it wore weird. The bruise isn't shame. It's calibration. We build new workflows that seat anomalous signals at the table without handing them the gavel. Verification becomes a loop, disciplined minds, disciplined machines, each checking the other. Stargate's most radical legacy wouldn't be proof of psi. It would be the design principle that cognition can scout possibility space and hand engineers a shopping list. The list here is blunt: distributed control, predictive flow shaping, sacrificial skins, field shielding, maintenance rhythm. If it isn't real, the outcome is still radical. A blind human operator simulated alien engineering with function-first accuracy inside a target no one could visit. That means minds can produce coherent, testable design under sensory starvation. An internal CAD system that invents plausible machinery from constraint and hint. Consciousness would be more than a camera. It would be a hypothesis engine that outputs blueprints you can try to falsify, that reframes remote viewing as a research tool on cognition itself. How disciplined attention converges on structure under noise, when it fails, and why certain verbs recur across operators like motifs in a language older than nouns. In a feed built for hot takes, that's the viral twist. The scariest machine might be the one between your ears. If it isn't real, we still got a design brief for harsh environments. Engineers can lift the transcript's verbs and ignore the origin story. Harvest from turbulence, stabilize with phase-locked nodes, shield with graded layers, plan for designed loss and graceful reconfiguration. That brief already matches where aerospace is going: mesh control, active skins, fault-tolerant autonomy. The protocol lesson also scales. Keep nouns off the table until functions stack. Pre-register criteria. Pair human hypotheses to probe schedules. Write transcripts like test plans, not myths. If Jupiter was only a mirror, it reflected a method demanding tighter rigs, harsher auditors, cleaner comparisons. Either way, the frontier moves. Consciousness, long treated as noisy byproduct, starts looking like a sensor you can train, fallible, variable, but capable of sketching structure that algorithms can chase or kill. Materialism doesn't collapse under that. It gets homework. Build instruments to check cognitive outputs where physics allows. Accept that some signals will outpace feedback for years and still deserve shelf space. The page marked "Engineering in a Storm" becomes a template. One column for verbs, one for physics tests, one for missions that could say yes or no within a human career. The path forward is boring in the best way. Replicate, pre-register, blind harder, compare across operators, and tie sessions to missions with pre-planned metrics, spectral lines, shear anomalies, radiative flickers. Archive everything. Grade only functions. Reward convergence, not drama. If there's architecture in storms, it will endure our skepticism. If there isn't, the engineering we build to check will still make us better at living in turbulent worlds, our own included. The meaning isn't belief. It's discipline pointed at wonder without letting wonder write the report. Resolution and broader meaning. If a human mind brushed a machine inside Jupiter, myth and contact already overlap, and the line we draw between them is the only boundary left. Subscribe and watch the next episode for the declassified packets, transcript excerpts, and our moon follow-up. Drop your verdict, base or brain, in the comments, and tell us which target we chase next.